Following the failure and subsequent abandonment of Terra Online, a video game we have covered already on the Death of a Game series, PUBG developer Bluehole Studio, despite their success in the Battle Royale realm, was intent on not abandoning the MMORPG market just yet. Bluehole would launch Elyon, a steampunk MMORPG published by Cacao Games of Black Desert Online fame, back in October of 2021 in the West. Elyon would be unable to wow players the same way the previous title Terra Online did, and Elyon, much like Terra did later on, would falter in the East, before ultimately reaching its current form in the West, which within a few months has already spiraled down in player count, with recent population numbers dropping on average to just 224 players. What went wrong with Elyon? Or Air, Ascent Infinite Realm as it was originally known as? And why, despite having the powerful backing of Bluehole Studio and Cacao Games, was the title unable to impress, innovate, or offer something new enough in the space to attract a long-term audience, or really any audience at all? On this episode of Death of a Game, we cover the subsequent follow-up of another MMO we have covered on the series and attempt to find the largest contributing factors for the game's failure as a title. Pay attention to the clues shown along the way, as they will hopefully illuminate more of the mystery. But if you missed anything, stay tuned to the very end of the video for the final deduction, where we put the evidence and various clues all together. But for now, get to the airship, detectives. We've a mystery afloat. This video is sponsored by World of Tanks. World of Tanks is a free-to-play game with over 100 million players worldwide and for PC. The game has more than 600 tanks to choose from and battle with: destroyers, artillery, light, medium, and heavy tanks. With the ability to drive your tank in over 40 arenas and do battle over open fields, deserts, steep hills, and even urban and industrial zones. The historical accuracy and inspiration means that the authentic models and vehicle characteristics in World of Tanks make you feel like you're inside of a real tank. Your tank is your character. You can earn experience, modify, and upgrade your tank. If you'd like to find out more about World of Tanks and get your chance to do battle on a tank online, there's a link to download World of Tanks in the description. And when you register your account, make sure to use code TANKMANIA to get a free 7-day premium account, 250,000 credits, and the premium tank Excelsior Tier 5, and 3 rental tanks for 10 battles each: the Tiger 131, the Cromwell B, and the T3485M. Thank you again to World of Tanks for sponsoring this video. Let's get back to the mystery, detectives. The story begins back in early November 2016. While Terra Online was still finding some success on console titles especially, powerful Korean publisher Cacao Games, in conjunction with Bluehole Studios, the developer behind Terra Online, would announce a new mystery project dubbed Project W. Working on 2 MMORPGs simultaneously isn't unheard of, especially for a Korean developer the size of Bluehole Studio, who was looking to join the likes of Nexon and NCSoft, who would boast multiple titles in their stables. But there was a sneaky question of, was Project W set to replace Terra Online once it faded further into obscurity? Terra Online was not quite on the level of success as PUBG would be for Bluehole Studios, which a success would truly catapult the company. Still, Terra Online was a genre-pushing title boasting combat the MMO industry hadn't yet fully seen. It was an impressive, though flawed title. Cacao publishing Project W seemed like a no-brainer for Cacao. With Bluehole's successful track record and the backing of Cacao, Project W, now going under the name Ascent Infinite Realm a year later, was on track to be the next hit from the East. With the announcement of the name also came details concerning Bluehole's latest MMO in development. Ascent Infinite Realm, as the name would sort of imply, would feature airships and flying mounts, offering multi-dimensional gameplay set in a steampunk world. Described as an open world full of adventure and faction versus faction PvP that you could experience with an open, vast sky, where you could interact with player housing that was described as estates that could be linked with other players. The airship and vertical combat teasing itself would theoretically set Ascent Infinite Realm apart from the pack, since such things were rare in MMORPGs, and the expectation was that if the combat was anything like Terra, it would make for quite the unique and enjoyable experience in conjunction with the airship and verticality mechanics. 5 classes would be announced, being a rather standard fare offering of Warlord, Sorceress, Gunslinger, Assassin, and Mystic. Warlord and Assassin being the melee-based classes that do as they imply, while the Sorceress and Mystic were magic wielders. Finally, the Gunslinger, which was the most self-explanatory. These classes seem like a bit of a downgrade in simplification from Terra, which managed to still make their classes feel a bit more unique. The rest of the content offering teased seemed quite standard fare thus far, and mimicked Black Desert Online in many ways, such as PvP in-game focus, no in-game raids or dungeons, and more of a focus on mob grinding and gear progression. This meant that Air was heavily reliant on having a good combat loop, and would be offering less PvE content than Terra Online did, which was actually known quite well for their quality PvE dungeons at least early on. This meant that Air was more akin feature and content-wise to Black Desert Online than Terra Online. Footage of Ascent Infinite Realm was shown at the popular gaming convention in Korea, G-Star, in 2017. Bluehole Studios would showcase the highly touted centerpiece Realm vs. Realm PvP in Ascent IR, as well as the much-teased airship combat. The airship gameplay that was showcased looked certainly fun and unique for an MMO, albeit a bit limited. The ability to traverse with your airship was promised though. The biggest dagger that came out of the news release and gameplay showcase at G-Star was the announcement that Air would be developed utilizing the Unreal Engine 3 and not Unreal 4. Now, if you've watched any other MMO episodes on the series, you've probably at some point encountered Unreal Engine 3. Unreal Engine 3 doesn't have a good track record with MMOs, not quite the success that Unreal Engine 2 had with Lineage. A few Unreal Engine 3 titles such as Marvel Heroes and APB we have already covered on this series, and both suffered from serious bugs and performance issues. There is a few reasons for this. To sum things up simply, that UE out of the box doesn't really work for MMOs, like most engines, but to get an engine largely designed for max 64 players to work, it takes a lot of reverse engineering. But just because Air wasn't using Unreal Engine 3 didn't mean that the game was somehow destined to fail. After all, Terra Online, which was a marvel for its time, was built using Unreal 3. It just explained the very blatant performance issues, alpha or closed beta footage or not, that you could witness when watching the gameplay footage for Air. Such a title, I believe, would benefit from shying away from massive online player counts and instead focus on smaller player counts for more directed content, allowing for more graphical fidelity and combat. But Air was headed straight towards the massive label, as it was attempting to host massive RVR battles as a PvP-focused MMO. The question would be, could they ultimately do such with the Unreal Engine 3, where nearly no other MMO had done very successfully before? Ascent would have its first beta exclusively in Korea, January 2018. Korea getting the main focus of a Korean MMO is pretty typical, and kind of goes with the name. This means that things like beta and launch will happen first in the East, as will new content, updates, and expansions. And that will then trickle down to the West. It was quite a common approach that many Western players had, frankly speaking, grown tired of, for a few major reasons. For starters, it means that you're not the main focus by nature, and no player wants to feel like they're not the primary focus. This is a cascading effect though, as the market in Korea also functions very differently and has more prevalent and widely regulated microtransactions. This means that anytime a Korean title is ported to the West, it brings problems with possible monetization models not being accepted in the West as easily, on top of issues like localization, which is actually a fairly complex process. Other issues include getting content later than Korea, and Korean players getting a massive global game advantage by kind of getting a head start. Air would have more beta tests that same summer, on top of the tests in other areas of Asia such as Thailand. Meanwhile, the West wouldn't likely see a beta test session for another year. I just asked the question, when will Korean developers start taking a more Japanese approach and actually start launching online RPGs at the same time globally, as well as producing content at the same time globally? If you think that this is a total non-issue, I just point to Final Fantasy XIV, which launched globally, as in around the world. And then I just kind of drop my mic. But I don't actually drop it because it's on an arm and it's really expensive and I need it. Throughout multiple instances in the East, the early trailer footage showcased quite apparent performance issues in Air. This was worrying some as they didn't think that such issues would be fixed before launch. But there were more concerns with Air even so early on. The combat in Air was a bit more traditional tab target style, despite the appearance that it would be action-based or the expectation coming from TERA Online's legacy. Those expectations would be even stronger now, with Bluehole having effectively abandoned development on TERA by this point in 2020. Bluehole Studios' March 2020 would announce major changes promised for Air going forward, to try and account for this, but not really detailed how that would be besides hints that it would be related to the combat system, and have a vote for which was preferred, tab target or an action combat system more like TERA. That wasn't all that would be changing with Air. In fact, Air would be Air no more, both literally and figuratively, as I will further explain. Now being renamed to Elyon, April 3rd, 2020. But it wasn't just the name that would be changing in April. Massive changes would be coming to the game, forever changing its design and shifting away from the initial vision and marketing promises. Bluehole Studios would be changing the way airships function in the game altogether. Whereas before they played in a slightly more open fashion with tighter flight controls. Instead, Bluehole would shift to a larger airship combat style that felt a lot more cinematic yet limited in the ways that you could play it and operate the ship overall. The reasoning given was that people were avoiding each other too much in the world, and they wanted to limit airships to the RVR mode and the island exploration, which was more for hunting PvE and treasure. This meant that in the end the aerial combat would be limited heavily. Elyon, dubbed for the portals that would lead to the conflict between the two factions in the game, would also tease a shift from their tab target combat system to a more action-oriented combat system. Vertical gameplay wasn't the only thing nerfed after the major changes in April. So was the grounded mech gameplay that was quite unique and enjoyable for Elyon, whereas now it was only limited to RVR scenarios. Elyon might have been a PvP-focused MMO, and that still remained, but losing what made the game unique outside of that before they even launched it was not going to bode well going forward. The Korean launch date for Elyon would be announced December 2020, with the Western launch to come at least like 6 months later. This would mean that if Elyon wouldn't do well in Korea, they could always at least recoup some of their losses back by the Western launch, since like no one checks what happens in Korea launches for some reason. But if the Korean launch didn't do well enough, it would nearly for sure spell the end of Elyon at some point, as the content trickle would be next to non-existent from then on. Bluehole was not opting to utilize a Western studio for the Western launch either, which kind of furthers my point. Some of you might be thinking, well, what if Bluehole did really care about the Western audience and them launching it later doesn't really disprove that? Then why aren't they learning that at this point the Western audience is smart enough, usually, Black Desert Online notwithstanding, to know when content is arriving later to them, and when they aren't a primary focus? Elyon, as promised, would launch December 10th, 2020 in Korea and Asia, the home market. Bluehole had the chance to once again wow the internet with yet another flashy MMO from Korea. What came out instead following the Korean launch was, well, a whole lot of nothing, really. Well, eventually. The initial launch managed to place Elyon on top of Korea's most played PCbang list, which is an important list for tracking the lifeblood of the PC audience and what they're playing in Korea. Within a few months post-launch, though, and Elyon had fallen from the top of the charts, now well below the top 50 most played. Simply put, Elyon had been a massive failure in Korea, and if they were going to recoup some of that money spent on the development, they were going to need to look to the West as many titles had done before. Elyon not doing well in Korea would mean very worrying things to the project going forward, as historically when Korean MMOs don't do well in their home audience, the developers are far more likely to shutter the game, Western success or not. I'm looking at you, City of Heroes. In many cases, the Western audience for Korean MMOs is treated as an extension of their audience, and not a true focus audience. Coming to save the day was the announcement of the Western closed beta meant to come sometime in May. The early closed beta impressions weren't very good though, especially for a product that had already launched in Korea. Well, besides massively OP who basically performed fellatio on the title, likening it to a mix of Black Desert Online Lineage 2 and Guild Wars 2, highlighting their impressive character creator and rather par for the course MMO features, all the while acknowledging, I quote, "It's not super impressive." MMO Fallout in their impressions would state most simply that Elyon wasn't TERA. and they meant that in the pejorative sense. It was worse, described as essentially a cheap copy of a game that's clearly meant to make money utilizing pay-to-win and gacha mechanics. So either the game didn't do well in Korea because of either of these major issues, which both wouldn't bode well. If monetization was bad enough to flop the game in Korea though, dear God, what did we have in store? Things weren't looking any better by the end of the beta, which was extended because of initial server issues. The second beta for Elyon would take place in June and would feature a new class, the Slayer, clearly an ode to Terra as a class of that game, as well as feature a number of other changes regarding leveling and showcase the dreaded in-game shop. Leveling would get a 15% increase in experience, which some could see as a positive. However, this is always a red flag for me because it usually means that the developers didn't balance the game effectively, or players were complaining about said leveling experience too much and they had to make it easier. Both could also be true, but the leveling experience in Elyon was bad, for a few reasons. It was a boring run-of-the-mill leveling experience not so subtly disguised as a tutorial, but sold as a story campaign. Increasing the leveling experience just to attempt to speed that process up was a band-aid fix. These changes, new class or not, weren't going to be enough to greatly change the impressions that were formed 1 month prior and across the pond the past year in Asia. To make matters even worse, the warned about cash shop ended up being even worse than imagined. Not only did it have the par for the course experience boost, drop rate increases, and cosmetics, it also had things like resurrection scrolls and pets which would offer various different important perks, just like Black Desert Online. But the kicker comes from the Luminous system, which is a standard grind and breakdown enchant system or craft system which encourages players to put more money in to get a better grade of gear or grind an inordinate amount of time. According to the article, 2 months of daily hardcore grinding or about $400 in microtransactions could get you a maxed Luminous, which was essentially an accessory that you wore that gave you better stats. This would be a direct pay-to-win power system, no matter how all-encompassing or not it was. These sorts of monetization strategies are common in free-to-play titles, but Elyon was still buy-to-play, which made the transactions hit all the harder, because not only did you have to buy the game for $40, you had to then potentially spend more in a multitude of ways designed to nickel and dime you further, or frustrate you until you pay for it. By September though, Elyon would change from being a buy-to-play title to a free-to-play title. Though Bluehole and Kakao's reasons for doing such most likely have more dubious motives, such as them not being able to sell the game at a $40 price tag, and them trying to cash out as much as possible using more strong-arm methods like blatant microtransactions and gacha mechanics. Whatever the reasons in the end may be, they guaranteed that more people would be playing Elyon upon its Western release, with it now being free, which definitely means that more money is going to be earned in the end, because after all, free-to-play is an oxymoron. Bluehole's response for those that were decrying the pay-to-win Luminous system was, well, no response. It's hilarious because even this article says that they elaborated, but all they did is just explain the system more, which I think should give you an idea of what their motives are. At least, I think. Elyon would have a head start launch available to those who pre-ordered the game. A free-to-play game, by the way, October 17th, before following it up with a full Western release October 20th, 2021, only on PC and on the Steam platform, with no news of a possible console launch mentioned either. On Steam, Elyon would score a 54% mixed score from 4,315 user reviews. Meanwhile, wouldn't even have enough gaming outlets to cover it to get an aggregate review score on Metacritic from the critics. MMO content creator MMOByte, who reviewed Elyon, would be rather positive about the title, likening it strongly to Terra Online and Bless Online, both Unreal Engine 3 games, enjoying the graphics and combat offered as well as the various novel gameplay options. Though what I found most worrying in the MMOByte review was this quote: "After playing this game for over 40 hours total, including the beta test, I can say with 100% certainty that maintaining an FPS where the game feels and plays smoothly is nigh impossible." MMORPG.com would score Elyon a 7 out of 10, enjoying the steampunk theme that was quite rare in the space and dimensional portals that offered PvPvE content. But they were negative concerning how much of the gear progression was RNG based and brought nothing new or innovative to the genre. Effectively, Elyon had launched as yet another copy-paste Korean MMO out of touch with the Western market, that couldn't even compete with the much older titles, let alone current ones. Even its coolest feature mentioned, the dimensional portals, is just lifted from another Korean MMO, Elyon. The new Steam launch would only yield 15,381 peak players, and 8,689 on average. Not very impressive. MMOs typically drop their player base after the first month, and have rarely ever increased in population, which didn't bode well for Elyon going forward. Within the end of the year, just a few months later, Elyon's population would be down to just 2,880 players peak, and 1,526 players average. There was no communication, and thus no community to sit around and wait for more Elyon updates or have trust in Bluehole Studios providing them. Which is why you can't skip the process of building one, because then in the end all you have is customers. And customers will be way more ruthless regarding your game and its quality, and they're not going to wait around for things to happen. By the summer of 2022, just around half a year after the launch, population of Elyon had dropped at peak to just 347 players, and 224 average players. And by checking the update pages, the only thing they seem to really actively update is the cash shop. There hasn't been a single major update, and no expansions either. There isn't any news of a console launch either, despite the fact that Elyon plays like it belongs on a console or was built with it in mind like Bless Online. So there's little chance on that front either. While Elyon isn't completely abandoned by Bluehole Studios yet, there's a minuscule population left and not a major update or serious update period in sight. The fate and future of Elyon is written on the wall at this point, with practically no chance at making a comeback. This is all but guaranteed by the dual-pronged failure in both the East and the West. But before we get into that segment where Conan shoots Kogoro and then makes him do the final deduction, oh wait, is that too on the nose? Let's cover a few more important things before then. Now, it's been mentioned a few times throughout the video, and it's by far one of the most common complaints surrounding Elyon. Many players did not only claim that Terra Online is better than the newer launched by a decade Elyon, they claimed that Elyon led to the death of Terra Online. A pretty bold claim, but it's hard not to see the weight and legitimacy of such. When following the subsequent abandoning of Terra Online, Bluehole Studios would launch Elyon. They were certainly working on it before then too, as far back as 2016, when Terra was still reaching success on console. But this isn't where the claim ends actually. It casts an even larger shadow because now the expectation becomes, Elyon not just has to be on par with Terra, it has to be better, and it simply wasn't. The combat, as you can tell from watching the game alone, I think, let alone playing, which puts you in control of a very clunky and subpar gameplay experience by comparison. Remember, Terra came out in 2011, so you can't one-to-one compare them. And the content offering in Elyon is worse too. You don't even get proper dungeons, and they serve more like dungeon arenas if anything. This greatly limits how the encounters could work, thus both making them more boring and less challenging. Where was that action combat that made Terra stand out, that made them innovative? The combat that in even the early dungeons at launch saw many players face their deaths, but have a blast during it all. Me being one of those players. Terra had challenging combat, but didn't completely abandon the very large and standard tab target audience either. Elyon though, combat revamp or not, which by the way makes it worse, because the combat they revamped it into is still not really better than the game that they made previously. So combat revamp or not, it's not better than Terra Online in 2011, let alone modern day action games like Dragon's Dogma. If you wanted to make an accurate comparison regarding Elyon and Terra, it would actually be that Elyon is like Terra. Just the more recent version of Terra that was dumbed down and completely ruined by Bluehole Studios. Striving to be as good as that version of Terra was not something that you should strive for. It might seem unfair to have Elyon so strongly compared to Terra, but considering it is from the same developer using the same engine and clearly borrowing many of the same assets, by the way, literally the same assets, but the jury is out on that one. Terra Online was just a better game than Elyon, and that severely hurt the longevity and success of it going forward. Alrighty, it's time to hit that music, Tom, and start our final deduction. I believe we have more than enough evidence at this point to put this case to rest concerning the largest contributing factors for the ultimate demise of Elyon. Unreal Engine's 3 historical performance issues strike again. Failed in the home market of Korea, and quite quickly. Clunky and uninspired combat. Elyon plays worse and delivers less than Terra, which is kind of the game it killed. The monetization is pay to win and convenience. Feels like a console game that never launched on console. Boring tutorial disguised as a leveling experience. They radically shifted their game design before launch. While Elyon could have had the opportunity to build on what Terra did right, and do such with the new steampunk theme that added with it airships, mechs, and new avenues for gameplay, in the end, it was a lukewarm thud. We can be annoyed that us Western players never got a chance to play the original version of Elyon, aka Air, the one that had more of the stuff that I just mentioned. But Bluehole might have done such because they built a game and game design that was unsustainable given their tech. So in the end, while their shift ultimately doomed the game, making it fail to ever reach expectations and escape Terra's shadow, it might have been necessary. That makes Elyon seem like it was doomed from the start. Which is tragic because following Bluehole's massive success with PUBG, we thought this was their chance to make an even bigger and greater MMO than Terra. Now, they might not ever make another MMO, and certainly not one to the standards set by Terra Online. There are many ideas concerning why this could be. For starters, Terra Online was built from a Lineage 3 prototype. There was even a lawsuit about it. PUBG also wasn't specifically Bluehole's, as it was spearheaded by an industry pioneer, Brendan Green. I guess what I'm trying to insinuate is that maybe Bluehole isn't just as much known for coming up with the ideas themselves as they are known for making other people's ideas come true. My advice, take it or leave it, is just hire somebody with a solid MMO idea and just produce that, Bluehole. That's worked for you guys, and I don't think you guys have ran out of money yet. Until the next case, detectives, though. Thanks for watching.